You are listening to Invisible Not Broken, a podcast where we talk about life with chronic illness and everything that goes with it. We interview inspirational leaders, compassionate practitioners, and chronic warriors we just find flat out fascinating. I'm Eva Minkoff, your co-host, fibromyalgia warrior, and founder of Wellacopia, the matching site that helps you find your ideal practitioners for your individual needs. Today's episode is about stigmas and speaking your truth. Meet Allie Cashel. Allie is a chronic Lyme warrior, published author, and organization founder who started a movement through storytelling. Her book and organization, both named Suffering the Silence, support people who struggle for illness recognition, visible and invisible, by helping them speak up and break the stigmas and ignorance that surround misunderstood chronic illnesses. Our conversation covers the unjust power dynamics in healthcare, the struggles in being misunderstood, and how we can grow stronger from other people's stories. I met Allie almost 3 years ago after reading her book and falling in love with her mission. Since then, we have hosted community events together and remained close during the growth of our initiatives. I'm so glad that Allie was able to come on the show because she's someone I truly admire and feel very lucky to have met. Before we get started, just a reminder that all conversations and health claims on this podcast are based on individual experiences and expertise. Everyone has their own personal and professional truths and should be treated as such. Okay, let's get started. Allie Cashel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I don't just know you as a leader, I know you as a person, and you are a wonderful human being inside and out. So I've given you a little introduction, but now I'd like for you to introduce yourself, to tell us your story with chronic Lyme, as well as Suffering the Silence, your book, Suffering the Silence, your organization, and share some stuff about you.
Yeah, thank you. So I came into work in the illness world. I sort of landed here without a plan. I was first diagnosed with Lyme disease in 1998 when I was 7 years old. I had a really classic presentation of the disease, like tick bite, bullseye, fever, all of the above, and was diagnosed right away. Sorry, I'm in Maine right now. Was diagnosed right away and went through a short course of antibiotics, and sort of everyone assumed that I was cured, I was fine. And it wasn't until I started to go through adolescence that a number of strange symptoms started popping up. I had pretty severe joint pain, severe fatigue, a lot of muscle and skin pain, terrible headaches. And we were trying to figure out what it might be. There was rheumatoid arthritis in my family, so we thought maybe it could have been that. But ultimately, after a local doctor actually approached us and started having conversations about Lyme, and in the community, we lived in a really endemic area. It was clear that I had a lot of the same symptoms and was tested again for Lyme, and my blood test came back positive, which in the Lyme world is actually sort of complicated because not everyone's blood tests come back positive. It's about 40%, the tests are accurate only about 40% of the time. So I've actually been really lucky to never have issues with getting a diagnosis around Lyme, because I've always had very clean and clear blood work. So I was diagnosed again. All through middle school and high school, I was in and out of treatment, which at the time I really didn't know was controversial because I was living in a place that so many people had been affected by Lyme. So many people were in and out of treatment for Lyme disease where I lived, working with doctors locally there to maintain symptoms and sort of keep quality of life as high as it could be. And I finally, my junior year of high school, I was actually pretty healthy. I was off all antibiotics. I was feeling good. I had a lot of energy. I fell in love for the first time that year. It was just this amazing killer year. And I sort of thought that my experience with Lyme was behind me. I thought that I had dealt with it. And that's been sort of a recurring pattern for me in a lot of my life with illness. Is it's sort of I get through a tough time and I'm sort of it's over, I'm done. Woohoo, I win. And it always somehow comes back to sort of rear its ugly head. But my senior year of high school, I'm the oldest of 5 kids and really, really, really close to my family. And my senior year of high school, my dad got a job in Boston. I grew up about an hour north of New York City and got a job in Boston. And my family was going to move to just outside of Massachusetts. And I was finally healthy. I was finally like attending school and immersed in the community. And the having to move right before my senior year felt terrifying and scary. And my parents decided, and I decided, we all decided together that it would be, I could stay behind and finish senior year at the school that I had started. And I would go back to see them whenever I could. But that summer that they moved, I started to get a lot of the old symptoms coming back. I was in pain all the time. I was really tired, but I didn't really want to say anything because I didn't want to freak anybody out. And I loved this idea of getting to stay and like being in this environment that I wanted to be in so badly. But I clearly should have said something because in the fall of that year, just when I started my senior year of high school, I experienced my first neurological symptoms of tick-borne disease. I was in 6 car accidents in just 6 weeks. I was struggling to read. I was struggling to speak. I was getting lost on my way to school. Some really, really, really scary neurological stuff. And I had never experienced neurological symptoms of Lyme disease before or tick-borne disease before. And so my parents were really scared, and I was really scared, of course, because I didn't really know what it was. So we got really lucky to get in to see the head of pediatrics at one of the best hospitals in Boston. And in our first meeting, he took basically like one look at my file. He met with my mom for about an hour. He didn't do any physical examination, talked to me for about 10 minutes and made the diagnosis based on my history of Lyme treatment that I was having a psychiatric response to my parents' move, a mental breakdown basically, and that I was regressing to the point of infancy. That's why I couldn't read or write or drive a car, because I wanted them to come back. Like I missed them. I wanted to be cared for them. And I think that like that for me has been really the moment that has informed most of my work and most of my life and career is when you have a power dynamic like that, where you know, one of the best doctors in the world who supposedly knows everything tells you that you're not physically ill and that this condition is entirely in your head. I felt at the time powerless to say anything else, and silenced sort of by him and by the institution behind him, and felt like they were not invested in me and what was really going on. And as it turned out, I was not only dealing with Lyme, but also with 4 other tick-borne infections that had never been diagnosed, that caused pretty severe neurological symptoms exactly like I had. So I was able to get back to working with doctors who could help me and who did believe me and who did understand what was going on in my body. But it caused a real fissure for me in terms of understanding the connection between what was happening with my mental health and what was happening with my physical health. And I've obviously come to learn, as I'm sure many of your listeners already know, but they're incredibly intertwined. And I had a really hard time accepting that because I was so afraid of admitting that I was suffering at all with mental health, because I was scared that that would make people think that there was nothing wrong with me physically. And I think in the years since then, that's been a real battle for me in terms of learning how to care for my mental health at the same time as caring for my physical health. So I'm very lucky these days to, I'm not dealing with active Lyme or tick-borne infection anymore, though I do deal physically with a lot of the sort of repercussions of dealing with long-term infection and long-term treatment, and have found some other genetic issues that cause some chronic illness-like symptoms as well. So it's not that I'm not dealing with things physically, but I'm still learning how to sort of balance that mental health and physical health journey all the time. But this whole experience also brought me to make this into my work. I wrote a memoir about my experience called Suffering the Silence, and also interviewed a number of other patients from around the world who deal with Lyme, who face that same sort of dismissal and isolation. And through the process of working on that book, learned that that feeling of being dismissed was not unique to Lyme patients and not unique to people living with tick-borne disease. This is something that people, especially women and young women, deal with in the chronic illness world across diagnoses. And so I took my work with that book and along with a very close friend of mine who lives with lupus, Erica Lupinacci, started a nonprofit organization also called Suffering the Silence that works to break down the stigma surrounding the experience of chronic illness and disability in general. So that's where I am today.
Can you actually tell us a little bit more about you and Erica? Because I thought how you guys came to start this together is pretty interesting.
Totally. Yeah. So Erica and I were best friends all through high school. And we actually experienced the peaks of our illness at the same time. So both of us got incredibly, incredibly ill senior year of high school. But we talked about everything other than that. We talked about boys and school and drama and whatever play we were in, and never addressed the fact that we both had these pretty serious health setbacks at the same time. And could have really been a huge support for each other, and were not. And in looking back on that, after we graduated from high school and I was working on the book, we started talking about sort of how strange it was that we felt like we couldn't talk to each other. And if we felt like we couldn't talk to each other, so many people must feel like they can't talk about what's going on with them too, because we were so close. Like, we talked about everything. And I think that realization was really what caused us to know that we had to do something to help people feel like they could speak up, could talk to each other, could talk to their loved ones about what was going on with them, to sort of push back against those feelings of isolation, those feelings of dismissal that are often caused by medical trauma, or even just interpersonal relationships where they don't feel believed or don't feel understood.
Yeah, it's so remarkable that that's the case, and it still is today, of course, but I think maybe I'm just in this little bubble right now, but I think we're on the up and up where people are more open about it. Luckily, while there's definitely a stigma around invisible illness and mental illness in particular, I think we're trying to uncover that now, and people are making it very clear that mental illness is also an illness, just like anything physical.
Yeah.
So I think we're on the road, us as a society.
I think we're on the road too. I mean, even in the last, Suffering the Silence, the book came out in 2015, I think.
Yep.
So it's been 4 years. And even since then, like, conversations are even just about Lyme disease and tick-borne disease in general have shifted a lot. There's so much more acceptance now than there was when I was writing the book, and even when I was dealing with it myself. So it's very cool to see that progress, but I also am always really aware that even as that progress is happening, there are people right now today who are being diagnosed with these conditions and who aren't getting the support that they need, and who are having really negative, silencing interactions with doctors, or silencing interactions with friends and family. And just because we are seeing a lot of that progress doesn't mean that we don't need to be doing work to support the people who are living with these conditions and having these experiences right now.
Absolutely. And just in case you don't recognize this enough, you are one of the reasons that this is happening. Like that this progress is happening. Is it you writing your book and the events you put on and the artistic contribution, all the things that you and Erica do are a huge reason for why this does exist in the public, that we are starting to hear about it. So thank you. And it's funny, as you're saying this, I don't know why I didn't realize it, but that's probably what led me to contact you. So just to take us back, I'm actually, I could pull up the email, but I don't want to interrupt right now. But I actually remember writing it pretty well. I remember being at my kitchen table, looking at Suffering the Silence, reading about you guys, and being so excited. More excited than I had been about writing most emails. I don't know if you remember me telling you this after the fact.
Yeah.
I wrote like a freaking paper to you. Just like, I love everything.
It's really cool. And I think like getting to connect with people like you is a huge part of what's so amazing about this work, is that there are so many people out in the universe who are doing work to help support this population of people. And we are sort of all doing it in silos, or we all started in our own silos, sort of, because most of this work comes out of need, right? We see something or have experienced something ourselves that we feel like needs to change. And so then we start doing that in our own lives, in our own universes. But I think the more that we can come together and connect with each other and sort of join forces, the faster this bigger cultural change to sort of break down stigma and create a better understanding of these life experiences will happen. Because it's 40% of the population of people. Just in the US, it's 133 million people who are dealing with these conditions. The fact that we still can't talk about it, like at a cocktail party or at the office, makes very little sense, to me at least. And so I hope that by like connecting with, like as we've done, working together, and the more that people can do that, I'm hopeful that we can start to really move the needle.
Yeah. By the way, so I've had to look up a lot of statistics lately because I have a startup and we have to. And a couple surprising ones. I'm actually annoyed because one of them's not in front of me. It's either 92 or 96, but whatever, it's 90s high of people with chronic conditions are misdiagnosed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's crazy to think about, is that I also think so much about how I'm a real believer in the power of dialogue in general. Like when people start talking about things, whether it's like in their own houses or more publicly online if they're writing about it. But I think any place that these conversations are happening start to really like slowly change the way that people think about something. And let's say you have been misdiagnosed and you do feel like you can talk about your symptoms, someone else is likely dealing with something really similar to you. And I've seen this happen where people will start talking about something that they're going through, and someone will be like, oh my God, have you thought about blah, blah? And it's like a light bulb goes off in their head, and suddenly they're on the path to finding a better diagnosis. A more accurate diagnosis is probably a better thing to say. I think that like there's so much power in just being able to talk about it, but we have to find strength and comfort in being able to do that, because so many of us have been told basically that we shouldn't. It's a hard sort of balance to strike, I think.
Yeah. And I personally it's amazing. I'm all about communication too, right? Like Wellacopia is a matching app, but it's about a human relationship and connecting with that dialogue, right? And every time I'm at a cocktail party or a professional thing or what have you, I'm meeting people, I still hesitate sometimes. But I also remember, well, now if someone's going to ask me what I do, and it's going to be pretty obvious that I have a chronic condition, but I still think about it, right? It doesn't fall off my tongue, if that's the expression. In fact, I love it now when I'm at events that are truly nothing related to my career or illness. Like I'm at a networking event here in Rochester, and I start talking. They're like an accountant. Actually, this has happened. They're an accountant. And at a networking event, people are really looking, what can they get out of it? And that's fine.
Yeah.
How it is. And I tell this guy, like, I've got a healthcare startup and it's about chronic illness. And then I start talking about the mission, and I see his eyes change. They're like wide, and you can see he's just in it. And I'm happy to say I get that a lot of the time, because this resonates, like what we do with Wellacopia resonates with most people on some level. But this guy, he was having terrible, terrible gastrointestinal issues and could not find a doctor to help him. And he wasn't telling anyone about it either. He would said, I just tell my wife, I got like a stomach ache. Right. And he got kind of emotional. And I don't want to say I was happy about it, but you know what I mean? I was like, I'm really glad that we can have this moment together, and that what I'm doing resonates with you. And actually I found him someone, so that's great. Check in on him. But yeah, the fact that we think it's, so I really wanted to talk about stigma. Something you're obviously very familiar with. We're all very familiar with. We're afraid to say something because it might make us look weak or people don't believe us. Actually, one of the other statistics is that 36% of people are told it's all in their head.
Yeah, yeah.
I actually think it's more than that, but it's definitely 36%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean, you had that for a very long time. I had doctors tell me essentially the same thing too, right? But and I guess they were great doctors, like on paper, New York City, Park Ave
Sure.
doctors. But like you said, you had this I don't know what kind of doctor he was, but you said someone who was high up on the ladder, really well respected, and you, yeah, it makes sense. At the time, you assume, well, they must be right. Like
I think we're taught.
they know best.
I think the other thing that's very real and that I always feel a real need to say is like they do, like these doctors know a lot. It's not that their perspective or their practice is wrong in any way. I think it's just that the way that our medical system is set up, it's very narrow, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for people to think outside the box of what else could be going on. So if something presents in one way that they've seen before, it's it's whatever. It's like you don't if you hear hoofbeats in the forest, don't think it's a zebra or whatever. You think it's a horse. And I think that's a decent instinct. It's just that so much of the time, people they slip through the cracks with that. And I think just more awareness of that process is important. And I think the other thing that's like that you brought up that I think is really important as it relates to stigma is also just like an awareness of power dynamics. Like in my situation, I was like a 17-year-old girl and he was, a 50-something-year-old man. And there are power dynamics in that room that we need to be aware of all the time, that, no one tells you about when you're a young woman who's dealing with health issues, that you're going to have to be navigating that as well. And I think there are so many things that we don't talk about, health and illness being one of them, but also just this acknowledgement of the way that those types of dynamics influence our care and our health and the way we move through the world all the time. I wish I had been able to talk about that more as a young woman, for sure.
Parents are a big one too, that I think gets confusing because there's usually that natural power dynamic of we are your elders, we are your caretakers.
Sure.
Respect. What we have to say is going to be right. Although when you're teenagers, you always want to fight against that. But anyway, I guess I'm just thinking of my dad, my wonderful father, who still honestly to this day wonder if he truly gets and believes, but I'm not going to hate on him for that. He definitely called me a hypochondriac when I was young, for sure. And he saw doctors as gods. Basically what they say is it's got to be right. They know best. And like you said, most of the time they do.
Yeah.
But I always struggled with that because my dad is very smart. My dad is loving. These doctors are smart and some of them were loving.
Yeah.
I started to think I was freaking nuts. Like, really?
Yeah.
We all do, right? I think most of us at some point or another, if we're told it's all in our heads, I mean, I don't know how often this is that we fight back immediately, but I think we all at least at some point consider, well, maybe it is all in my head.
Oh, I mean, I consider that all the time still, like that's
well, like different parts of it. It's like, I know that I have pain. It's more like maybe the severity of something at certain points. I'm like, is this really as bad as I think it is right now? Or what's going on?
I think that so I've been thinking a lot about that phrase, like all in your head, as a dismissive phrase. And it's troubling to me because to say something's all in your head and sort of being like, okay, you're out, like this is not my problem anymore, implies that if it was in my head, right? Like, let's say I was having a psychiatric breakdown, that should not be dismissed. Like, that's a very, very, very serious and life-altering thing to have happened. Like, if that had been the root of it, like I was not met with the level of care that I was supposed to, or I should have been. And is that because we're not invested in general in mental health experiences? We dismiss young women's narratives of their experience all the time anyway. Like I think that there are so many levels at which that phrase, it's all in your head, can be really, really damaging to patient experiences because it ignores their physical experience. But if what happened to me is similar to what happened to anybody else, it creates this intense fissure of being like, well, that means mental health is not important, or that means mental health should not be, taken seriously. And that's really troubling. And has really, if I'm honest, in the last 10 years has been like, that's been the biggest battle, is learning how to accept and come to terms with my mental health and the way that it intersects with physical health for me.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And thank you for saying that. I have said on other episodes, so like a lot of the practitioners I bring on, which I think it's not coincidental. I talk to all these different practitioners, and somehow we always get on the topic of basically the mind-body connection and why they're intrinsically connected to one another. There is no separation. And whether that goes for chronic stress causing physical pain, or it goes for mental health being its own kind of pain. And that goes along with this movement, thank God, about identifying mental illness as an illness. Because it is. And yeah, that's what I was thinking when you talked about how he said this was a psychiatric issue. It's like, okay, well, that's a medical issue.
Yeah, and needs to be met. A pretty intense intervention. I think about that all the time. And I think, through our work with Suffering the Silence, one of the things that we do is we do a number of photojournalism campaigns, portraits, things like that, to give people an opportunity to tell their story in some platform in some way. And we just recreated our original Suffering the Silence portraits that we did 5 years ago now. And we made sure to include a mental health diagnosis in this group of people that we featured, because I think it's so important to acknowledge, as we talk about any sort of chronic condition, the impact of mental health and sort of the importance of inclusion of mental health in that category.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also really glad that you're doing more of those portraits.
Yeah.
They're amazing. They're amazing. I mean, I'm going to have this in the show notes, of course, but you guys all need to go to Suffering the Silence, because there's so many beautiful displays of, oh wait, is it .com or .org?
Either.
Oh, very nice. You have both. Yeah. That's why I don't know. Yeah, you have so many wonderful exhibits of these photos and now films. Actually, yeah, I want to hear about what you're developing. This documentary called, what was it?
It's called Trust Me, I'm Sick. Yes. So it's a 5-piece documentary of short episodes. They're around 5 minutes each, 5 to 6 minutes each. And we've been really lucky to partner with a filmmaker, Sarah Stewart, and Arlo Pictures is her production company, who has created the films, and we've been working with her to create them. Erica, my co-founder, is actually a co-creator on these films as well. And what they do is they tell the story of a group of people, all of whom have different diagnoses, and explore the way that illness influences certain aspects of our life. So like illness and work, illness and relationships, illness and mental health, all different things like that, to try and take a look at the way that this influences our whole life and our whole identity as people, not just our identity as a patient. Because I think a lot of times in this world, it's like, oh, you have lupus and therefore you're like patient 542 or whatever, we don't understand the full picture of the way that this affects us as human beings. And I think that's where a lot of the most interesting conversations are to be had. Like if you're living with a long-term illness, how does that affect your job or your sense of success, the rhythm of your day? It's not so much about, it doesn't always need to be about what your physical symptoms are, which are important to talk about, of course, but also like, who are you as a person, and how has this shaped you as a human being who's moving through the world, and how can we best support you as friends, as allies, as husbands and wives, or whatever that you are, to live as complete and as satisfying as a life as you possibly can.
Now it's time for a short break. But unlike typical podcasts with ads, I have something more important to share with you today. Wellacopia has only been live for a few months, and already we have people seeking practitioner matches in 42 states and 5 countries. We're thrilled that so many of you have come to Wellacopia to find the right care, but our unexpected national reach is making it harder to keep up, but we're not going to give up. Wellacopia is a community, not just a company, and community means working together. In order to bring on enough practitioners to support Wellacopia's growth around the country and the world, we need your trusted referrals. If you have a medical or wellness provider you love and trust, gift them to another warrior by joining Wellacopia and submitting your referral. Thousands of you are listening to this podcast. If each of you recommends just one practitioner, hundreds of thousands of chronic illness warriors like you will benefit. You may even be saving someone's life. If you don't have a health professional to recommend, you can still help us help you. The more people we have on Wellacopia, the faster the community grows and the better the matches will be. Joining takes just 2 minutes. It's free, and whether you recommend a practitioner or not, just by signing up, you are making a difference in the future of healthcare. Wellacopia matches people with practitioners who are best for them, not just as patients, but as people, because the patient-practitioner relationship is a human relationship. Matching with the right doctor should be treated with just as much care as matching with the right life partner. After all, they may actually be your life partner in your health journey. Through matchmaking, those with chronic illnesses will feel heard and cared for, and practitioners will feel fulfilled in their purpose as health professionals. At the end of the day, we're not cars going to see mechanics. We're all people connecting with people. Join our mission to humanize healthcare. Be part of something big, really big. Believe in yourself and your community to make a difference in our healthcare system without having to rally or sign petitions, without even having to leave your bed. By joining Wellacopia, you are automatically part of the mission to create better patient-practitioner relationships, and better relationships lead to better health outcomes and quality of life. Please pause this podcast. Take the next 2 minutes to join Wellacopia, and don't forget to recommend a great medical or wellness practitioner if you have one. Thank you. Those of you who have joined have made a difference. If you have any questions or feedback, or want to partner with Wellacopia's mission in any way, feel free to send me an email at eva, that's EVA, at wellacopia.com. Now, let's get back to the show. What I admired actually in my GP over the last few years is that he would always have me come in and ask, what's going on? Mm-hmm. And so I would start talking about fibro or something physical that was going on. And he said, no, what's going on with you in your world? Like, what's up? Yeah. And I loved that he did that, because he knew that the full picture is how he could be knowing the whole picture is how he could be the most proactive in my care.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so important. And I think the other thing that's really important with talking about sort of the way that this influences life in general, it's something that we've been trying to do in all of our storytelling work. It's really a push towards that. Is people who have not experienced illness personally are often really afraid of engaging in a conversation about it ever. They're like, oh, that's too sad. That's too dark. That's not something I can talk about. So if we frame the conversation instead around, challenges at work, right? Like, everybody can talk about that. Everyone has had some experience that they can immediately relate to. If my story is shaped around the way that I manage fatigue through my workday, that suddenly becomes less scary to talk about, because it's something that they have an sort of like an empathy entry point to. And I think that creating these bridges for people so that it's not such a scary conversation or it's not such a sad conversation, really helps engage people who have not yet experienced this, or hopefully will never experience this, to be able to talk about it more openly, and actually connect with it.
So storytelling in general, that's your thing, which I love. I love that basically the mission is to speak out and tell your story in whatever way. Actually, this is what I usually say at the beginning of a podcast, is tell your story in whatever way that you want to tell it.
Yeah.
And that could be very specific about your illness, if that's one way you want to frame how you get the word out there about yourself and about others. Or it could be, this is my life, illness is a small drop in the bucket. And
Sure.
yeah, can you tell us some differences you've seen in storytelling, like the variations in how people like to express themselves?
Yeah. I'm like obsessed with storytelling. I mean, humans love stories. We like, as a species, we love stories. We've always loved stories. So I think, in general, like in many different parts of the world, we could do a better job of using stories to help us fulfill sort of the missions that we want, whatever that social good or whatever you're trying to do. I think storytelling should be a really key part of it, because something happens inside of us when we listen to people tell stories. We lean forward, we are immediately engaged in a way that we would not be if someone didn't create a narrative structure or sort of drop us into wherever their experience was. So we run a retreat every year that's a storytelling retreat called the Spoonie Collective, in partnership with Zeno Mountain Farm. And so we get to see people go through this process of figuring out how they want to tell their story every year. And it's always really interesting because some people have this sort of immediate desire to tell like their diagnosis story, and they feel like their story is the story of how they got diagnosed. And we always sort of encourage people to say like, okay, like what's a different story that you could tell, you know, like something that's not a diagnosis story. Because if we put on a storytelling night and everybody got up on stage and said, I was diagnosed in 1998 and here's what it looked like and here's what my symptoms were, like the audience would not be engaged. So what we try and do is we try and say, what's something that has happened in your life that has been influenced by your experience of illness, for example. So I remember the first year I told this story about my now husband, who I started dating in high school, and how I was like totally obsessed with him because I thought he was this like rock star, high school theater kid, which is not a thing, but I thought it was a thing. And talk about, like, I told the story of meeting him and like the first time we really started talking and the way that like illness sort of shaped our relationship over those years. So the story was not really about my experience of illness as a high school student. The story was about my first high school boyfriend. And that's something that really anybody would want to hear a story about, right? Because they've all had a first high school boyfriend, or many of them have. Or we'll talk about, one of my favorite stories that we've had at the Spoonie Collective is about this hike that this woman, Erin, did, this long trek. She has fibromyalgia, and the story is about her trek. It's about her trip, her 40-mile walk. But through that, you start to hear sort of how fibromyalgia shaped that for her, what it felt like for her, what the challenges were because of this condition, right? So what I found is that the most powerful stories about our illnesses come from talking about our lives as people and finding the way that illness has shaped that or colored that or something. It's almost like it makes it from a black and white film into a color film. It's like the thing that gives the story life, but the story is not about the illness itself.
Oh, Allie, I love that. I love that so much. And as you're saying this, I'm trying to think of what are stories I would tell. I mean, I love stories, and I love storytelling. I'm a performer, and I don't know why. I could tell stories all the time, but interestingly, I wouldn't connect them, which is maybe a good thing, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Like, I'm a big traveler, and absolutely travel is definitely impacted by my conditions. I usually brush it off to the side as like well, yeah, I had this great experience, but this kind of sucked because I was like out of commission for a day or something. But yeah, it can be wrapped into the story, but it is not the story.
Exactly. And I think that that's like a really important thing for anybody who's like in like the depths of really intense symptoms too. Like your life is not your illness. Like your life is your life, and your illness is a huge part of that. But like wherever you are right now is going to be different tomorrow. You know, like it might be worse, but that's still a different story than the story you would tell today. Hopefully it's better. But I think that like the lack of permanence of storytelling is also something that I really has been helpful for me as I understand my own journey and have like come to accept a lot of my own journey. Is like the way that stories change over time has helped me realize, uh, you know, that like I won't be in pain forever, or I won't be depressed forever, or I won't be something forever. That's been really helpful for me.
What's your opinion on identity with illness? So I'm thinking the difference between illness being who you are and then identifying as someone with an illness. I see actually like a little difference. So I'm thinking about, I was actually comparing this with someone the other day. Okay, I guess I'll give an example. Like my friend has fibromyalgia. Mm-hmm. And it took a long time for people around her to really recognize that she has fibro. And now it's not an issue and people get that's her life. But she's also bi, and she's married to a man. And that, like, the not believing that she was bi was just as hurtful as, the people we were talking with couldn't understand why it was just as hurtful as not believing that she had fibro. And she said, they're both part of my identity. So regardless of me being married to a man, me being bi is a part of my identity. So is fibromyalgia.
Yeah, I think that's so legit. I mean, I think in general, like, there's a lot of progress being made around this, but people have sort of thought of identity as a singular thing for a long time. You know, what it meant to be a woman, for example, was one thing. What it meant to be a man was like one thing, and what it meant to be a Black man was different than what it meant to be a white man or whatever. And that's still very much the case, of course, in the way that we don't think of the way we think about race. But I think that what the progress that we are making is accepting that our identities are complex, and there's intersectionality in all of us. Some of us have many more intersecting identities than others, but I think that there are complex components to our identities regardless of who we are. And that might be gender, that might be race, that might be health status, that might be disability status, and that might change over time. Like there are times in my life where, looking back, I would certainly identify as a person with a disability. Right now, I don't identify as a person with a disability. So I think that like we're able to, as a culture and society, accept the intersectionality of identity and sort of the complexity of identity more and more. Again, this is all slow progress, and the more we talk about it, I believe, the better we'll do. But I think illness as identity, we actually have a photo project called Illness and Identity. In the same way that like my gender or my sexuality is a huge part of the person who I am, my illness is a huge part of the person who I am, because it has shaped the way that I move through the world, in the same way that as a woman, it has shaped the way I move through the world. Like my whiteness has shaped the way that I move through the world. And to not acknowledge a piece of one of those really formative things, I think isn't helpful. And we need to acknowledge basically what our privileges are through those experiences, and also what our privileges are not. You know, like if you're somebody who has lived with serious health setbacks or disabilities, like what effect has that had on your life? I think that's a totally legit thing to think about.
I love that you say like moving through life.
Mm-hmm.
That is a point, because that really is, it's what's your context, right? And as you move through life, and that changes. And yeah, you definitely don't have to have a singular identity or even just the same one of your identities for the rest of your life. And as we're talking about this, I'm actually wondering, do I identify as someone with an illness? And I'm honestly not sure of the answer.
Right. I think
It's weird. Yeah.
yeah. And
Such
I
a
think
part of who I am, especially because my career, I guess, my mission revolves around me having an illness and being part of this community. But as a person, as an individual, let's pretend like I didn't have Wellacopia. Do I identify as someone with an illness? And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm like really stuck on this because the battle in my head right now is, but Eva, you're such a powerful person. How could you identify with someone as an illness? And I hate that that's what came to my mind first.
Yeah, that's right. That's this internalized stigma that we have about people who.
Yeah, got a stigma on myself. So.
Yeah, but that's work that we need to be doing around like dismantling so many of our internalized beliefs that are not fair to certain groups of people. I think like disability is a really interesting thing to think about there, and you know, the ways that languages are shifting around even like differently abled versus disability, and how people own some people really own the identity of being disabled and some do not. That hasn't been as clear with the illness world, but I think the same sort of idea and theme would ring true for people living with illness as it is what they're.
Yeah, it really is a very fascinating, I think, a fascinating trip to take with yourself.
Yeah, and like a worthwhile one, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm someone who's very introspective, so I think it's interesting that I haven't done that enough with this. Because I very much identify as someone with an illness when I think generally in relation to Wellacopia, and I'm proud. There's nothing, I mean, there's definitely nothing wrong with it, but there's, it's like I have no problem talking about it ever. But would I, if Wellacopia wasn't like something daily that I was talking about or thinking about? And I don't know, but I highly recommend everyone listening that if you don't know how you identify in all sorts of ways, not with illness, just anything, it might be a fun trip to take with yourself on your identity and explore what it used to be too and what it is.
Yeah, it's like accepting that it can change. Like the lack of permanence in we're humans change so much. Like we change all the time. The person who I was yesterday is not the person who I am today, and I think that that's been really liberating for me. And realizing that's been really liberating for me. But I'm sure for other people would be like totally sound crazy, but it's been a good thing for me to do.
And what was the name of the project, the Illness and Identity?
It's called Illness and Identity. Yeah, it's a photo documentary project.
Great. And that's on Suffering the Silence?
Yeah.
Good. All right. That's great. So I actually would love to talk more about you as a whatever word you want to put on it, like influencer, leader, advocate, someone who speaks for this community. What has that been like for you? What have you seen come from it? And then how have you seen, actually we're talking about changing and how we're different every day. How have you seen yourself change during all of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, so for me, being super involved in the community, I very rarely think about myself as somebody who speaks on behalf of the community, but rather I think I try and use my story to create spaces for other people to share their stories, because I think sort of like, who am I to speak on behalf of anyone? But if I can speak with other people, that's where I would feel the best. And so the work that I'm the most proud of, I think, is when I'm doing the least talking, when other people are the people who are sort of taking the stage and sort of shaping their dialogue or shaping the conversation around their experiences. But I think in the process of doing that, one thing that's been so helpful for me is like learning from other people's strength and other people's journeys, because I'm so often in spaces and in conversations about health and about like caring for yourself and like how you can manage health over a long period of time and manage illness over a long period of time. Like a lot of people do it much better than I do. And so I think the way that I've changed is I've come to accept so many things about my own journey by hearing it reflected in other people. Like even a lot of the mental health stuff, for example, like a lot of my acceptance around my own struggles with mental health and the connection between my mental health and my physical health came from talking to other people who had similar experiences and realizing like, wow, it's not like me alone on this island over here. Like I can see myself reflected in them. And I think that that's really that if anything, like as a leader or somebody who is speaking about illness and these types of things a lot, I hope that somebody else can see themselves reflected in my story, and that then gives them more strength to speak about their own. Because I think that's what I would hope anyway in my role as somebody who's more vocal. That's a really weird answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. And it is, people do learn and absorb things differently or process things differently. But I do think in general that listening to someone else's story is a great way to reflect on your own, because that's honestly how we naturally are.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. Like a negative word would say we're self-centered, but like that's not what it is at all. It's more like, okay, this is what this person's going for, and I feel for this person, and I'm engaging this person. Now, how do I relate to it? How is it relevant to my world?
Yeah. I also think we all are sort of self-centered, like I like we are. Like
we're humans, and we kind of need to be, as long as we're not just about us.
Exactly. Yeah, but I think that like that's been such an amazing part of this whole journey for me, and like has facilitated so much change and personal growth, is like to just be around other people who can talk about this stuff and are really comfortable talking about this stuff. It took me a really long time to feel comfortable openly talking about a lot of this. There are still things that I really struggle to talk about my illness experience and the way that it's like impacted family dynamics or things like that. I like really have a hard time talking about. And there are other people who I work with, who attend our events, who we've photographed or whatever, who are amazing at talking about that stuff. Like they're so well rehearsed, and they've already done all this emotional work to explore that. And when I see that happen, I'm like, that's amazing. Like how can I learn from this person? How can I mimic this person to bring that into my own version of healing or whatever weird journey I'm on? So I think like that's the coolest thing that happens with this, and like has facilitated so much growth, is like we just learn so much from each other all the time. Whoa. We learn so much from each other all the time. It's
yeah, I have to, I totally agree with that in my own community as well. I thought for a while that I actually couldn't identify with a lot of seekers or patients or whatever, users of Wellacopia, because a lot of the people who are on there are much more sick or frequently than I am. And I thought, wow, maybe I won't be able to connect with them as much, or maybe rather they will think that I can't connect with them as much. And that was a really stupid bias on my end, because we all have our individual journeys. But I haven't found that at all. In fact, I've really noticed that we learn from each other, and we have different experiences, even though there's common denominators. So we've like, I text like every user that comes on, and it's great having conversations. I wish they were face to face. Really wish they were, but they're all around the world. Yeah, it's amazing whether it could be uplifting or grounding. It's just everyone is so different in what they have to share, or also what they're struggling with. I might be struggling with something more intensely than someone is who is much more ill, like in and out of hospitals. And they can make me see something a certain way and advise, and maybe that could inspire them in different parts of their life that's hard. I love connecting with humans.
Yeah. And like for the most part, I think people tend to be, they want to be supportive of each other. Like they want to, I think mostly people are good. And a lot of times no one believes, or people think I'm like overly idealistic or whatever, but I really do believe that most people have like goodness in them. And like when we give people an opportunity to support each other and to empathize with each other and to connect with each other in a way that doesn't feel dismissive to any of those parties, like their life experiences, like there's kindness that comes all the time. And like I see it all the time. It's just a matter of like creating those spaces where we can talk openly about what our lives are like and how we need support, and how we can give each other support. So yeah, I love that about this work.
I 100% agree about there being goodness in pretty much everyone. I think exceptions might be sociopaths. I don't know, but like real exceptions.
Yeah,
but for the most part,
yeah,
humans have goodness in them. So, but I understand why people would think we're like overly optimistic or what have you. But my view is that everyone has a reason for being who they are. And I'm not going to talk nature versus nurture. I mean more like genetics aside, actually, I will say. You might have a predisposition to being more moody or something like that. But I know I am. But every person has a story for why they are who they are. They often don't know their stories, which is sad. And that's something to look into, and why therapy is great and all of that. But everyone got to where they are today from things that happened to them, things that they experienced, things that they responded to. So as we all know, you can be traumatized by something where another person would not be traumatized by it, right? So that's just an extreme example of how everyone experiences things differently. And I hate that this world is so intolerant of that. It's like, well, if I don't feel that way about something, why do you feel that way? Yeah. And that's why, maybe we'll be upset about someone being whiny when we don't understand why they would be whiny. I mean, there's a bazillion examples I could give, but when it comes to human connection, I think everyone can connect with everyone if they're open-minded to the fact that that person has a reason for being the way they are. Yeah, and yeah, it's hard, especially when that other person won't budge and they want to stay in their world of not understanding the other person, or maybe just don't want to connect. But I found that when I open the floor for vulnerability and honesty, that usually I'll get in return, oh, okay, I guess I can do that too. So if I say vulnerability, meaning, I don't want to go on a whole tangent about this, but vulnerability doesn't mean being weak. And for some reason, it's gotten that rap. I do not know why. Vulnerability meaning exposing the things about yourself that maybe you don't want people to see, admitting that you're wrong, and the underbelly, as Monica likes to say. So I feel like I've had a much easier time connecting with people. One might be because when I talk about my illness, that's like, hello, quote unquote flaw or thing that is not perfect about me. But in general, talking about sadness, depression, or bad things I've done, or things that are hard to talk about. And then other people will talk about things that are hard to talk about. And it's,
exactly.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And I think that happens a lot. And I think that that's the goal with all of this work, is to like help to facilitate more and more of those types of conversations.
Absolutely. I really hope that from this episode, everyone listening feels inspired to look deeper into what their stories are and then share them with others, because that is the easiest thing we can do, but for some reason seems like the hardest.
Definitely. Yeah. But you can.
But you totally can, whether it be verbally, in the written, drawing, and Allie and Erica through Suffering the Silence have showed that there's so many ways to express yourself, to tell your story, and there will be more to come on that. So I'll definitely be including in the show notes everything that you're doing. Please yeah, everyone please follow Suffering the Silence. Take a look at their past work and what they're doing now. I am so happy that I reached out to you almost 3 years ago and looked to connect because you are a mover and a shaker.
Thank you. So are you. It's wonderful to get to be on the show. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Allie. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Invisible Not Broken podcast. If you haven't already, please take the next 30 seconds to do these 3 things. Hit that subscribe button, tap those pretty stars to give us a rating, and share with one spoony friend. Stay tuned for our 100th episode next week. Woo! This episode was brought to you by Wellacopia. Join the movement to help chronic illness warriors like you, like us, match with the right care. Until next time, be kind, be gentle, be badass.